Pozdrav poštovani gledalci, najpoznatiji ekonomist na svijetu gost je N1 televizije. On je direktor Earth instituta na Columbia univerzitetu, specijalni je savjetnik generalnog sekretara Ujedinjenih nacija za borbu protiv siromaštva i za otpisivanje dugova najsiromašnijim zemljama. Profesor Jeffrey Sachs. Dr. Sachs, thanks so much for being with us today.
It's my pleasure.
Dr. Sachs, when you read or hear a sentence, Sachs should run for a president, what's your opinion on that?
Well, what I would say is that almost anybody would be a better president than the one we have right now. We have a real political disaster in the United States, but that's true, unfortunately, in many places.
Would you run for a president?
I would not run for president, but I would be very happy to advise someone that is running for president. Last election cycle, I advised Senator Bernie Sanders. He would have been an excellent president. He almost made it, didn't quite make it.
We'll discuss Trump's moves, but first of all, I have to ask you something else. You stated repeatedly that you listen carefully to what ecologists and other experts say from your own experience. How much governments and presidents are listening to what economists have to say now?
Well, I don't think politicians listen very carefully to evidence in general. Too many politicians are either corrupt or too many politicians are simply playing the game of power, and not enough politicians listen to what we need for the common good, which is what politics should be about. So politics should be about searching for solutions to problems like climate change or problems like poverty. But in most places in the world, politicians don't do their job properly because they pursue the game of power rather than the solutions. Power should be used for something good, not just for the game of who's on top. But unfortunately, we know that most political systems are not organized well enough to get the common good. And unfortunately, in my country, the United States, which is a famous political system because it was the first written constitution, we're having very serious problems as well. And that's creating problems for everybody else because the United States is so powerful.
Bosnia and Herzegovina is not so powerful. This is your first time here in this country. Probably you could see the poverty here. Unfortunately, what has happened in recent years in Bosnia and Serbia as well, and other countries of the Western Balkans, are mass departure of people towards the countries of Western Europe, of course, in a search for a better life. But what awaits them there?
Right now, I would say the mood is, as I think everybody knows, very difficult in a lot of places. We're in a cycle where there are a lot of promoters of hate and division. This is something this region knows, unfortunately, tragically well. But Europe, which is still feeling the anxieties over mass migration and over the financial crisis, is filled with politicians that are making their claim to power by fighting migration. You look at Salvini in Italy right now. He's a loudmouth. Unfortunately, really very nasty fight. There are many, many other politicians who are winning support by being quite nasty, I would say. That's Trump's strategy as well. And it's, again, a strategy known very well in this region because ethnic divisions are easy to play for political manipulation. And we're in a phase right now where this is a very real phenomenon, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, but Bosnia and Herzegovina is a really small country, so I would like to ask you how important is the size of the territory for, let's say, economic development?
The size of Bosnia and Herzegovina is not significant. What's significant as a negative or a positive, but what is significant is the peace of the whole region. So if Europe and the Middle East and North Africa and Russia are in a tough, conflictual environment, then a country that is right in the middle, like Bosnia, will not be able to thrive. If the general geopolitical relations are satisfactory, as they have been sometimes, then being a small country by itself is no disadvantage. In many ways, it can be an advantage. So we all depend on the broader geopolitics. And when the broader geopolitics are peaceful, optimistic, open, and looking to the future, everybody benefits. And when things turn tough, when Europe is divided internally, when anti-foreign sentiment is very strong, when there are wars in the neighborhood, like in Syria or Libya in the last 10 years, that obviously hurts everybody. So the question is not the size of Bosnia and Herzegovina by itself. The question is the relations with the neighborhood. Also, a country like Bosnia and Herzegovina depends not only on the broader relations, but on relations with the neighbors, with Serbia, with Croatia, because they're, of course, important economic trade relations and transport relations, the ports and the infrastructure, the road network, the power network, the fiber for informatics, all depends on good neighborly relations. We forget that in this world right now. I have a president who is, I think, extremely dangerous and irresponsible, but he wants to build a wall on the border with Mexico. This is a crazy idea, I'm sorry to say. I can't use a less word than crazy, because both Mexico and the United States depend on good relations with each other. We don't need a wall. What we need is some power lines, because Mexico, for example, has wonderful solar energy, and the United States burns too much fossil fuel, so we should be importing solar energy from Mexico. That's not a wall, that's a connection. That's what we need. And yet, of course, we don't think that way, or maybe I think that way, maybe others might, but the president, of course, makes his power by attacking Mexico, not by building together with Mexico.
I see, but I have to ask you, what do you know about the economic policy here in Bosnia, and what potentially could be improved?
Well, I think that what we really need is a new, brighter economic relationship, not only within Bosnia. Of course, there are, I'm sure economic policy could be better managed, but between the European Union, the whole Balkans region, Turkey, Russia. We're wasting our time fighting each other. This is really the terrible part. Of course, this country experienced the tragedy of terrible war, and then 2 decades of just rebuilding. Well, this is
23 years.
Yeah, this is a kind of crazy approach that I see all the time, that we bomb someplace and then go out and try to raise money for rebuilding. If we didn't destroy, we would actually, of course, be much farther ahead. This is a silly observation, it may seem, but we're so much focused on destruction. This country, of course, is so polarized still. This group, 3 presidents, it's a very complicated structure, because of all of the difficult relations among the different groups in the society, that creates a tremendous heavy process, of course, rather than a way forward for everybody. There's a lot of time saying, you have to do it, you have to do it, it's your fault, your fault. Well, this is a huge expenditure of time and energy that should go into investing, should go into innovating, should go into new science, should go into attracting tourism, building arts, many wonderful things. This is an amazing center of three civilizations, at least.
You mentioned President Trump several times.
Yes.
During the last couple of minutes, but these days there's much talk about the potential meeting between, especially yesterday, between the Russian and U.S. president, and what could that meeting bring? What do you think?
Well, such a meeting would be a good thing because we actually need a different approach vis-a-vis Russia, and there are many irresponsible actions on both sides, let's say, so neither side is faultless. But I was already advising in this region from 1989, so this is almost 30 years ago.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah, I was advisor to Poland and actually to the Yugoslav government and so on.
And what about Russia?
And I was advisor to Russia after, I was advisor to Mr. Gorbachev first, and then after Mr. Gorbachev to Mr. Yeltsin.
Because you have to admit there was a considerable misunderstanding of your role as an economic advisor in Russia.
Well, you know, I find it a little silly because people that sometimes weren't even born then think of things. But basically, what Mr. Gorbachev said was we need a common European home. And in fact, we need a common economic home from Rotterdam to Vladivostok. This was really a smart idea. I regard Gorbachev as the best statesman of the end of the 20th century. But of course, inside Russia, he's even, you know, despised. You created all sorts of problems. But the truth is, he had the right idea, which was let's make peace, let's end the divisions, let's have normal economic relations. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't see things that way, as you know. So rather than creating an open economic space, the United States wanted to say, we're the victor, we won. And so the United States, for example, rather than keeping good relations with Russia, said, we'll just expand NATO. We'll keep going all the way to the Russian border. This was a big mistake because this finally triggered a very bad reaction on the Russian side, but in my view, an understandable one. You know, the first move of NATO was Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland. Maybe that could be understood. But then NATO kept going east, and it reached the Baltic states, of course, and so on. Then in 2008, the United States said, well, let's invite Ukraine to NATO. Let's invite Georgia to NATO. If you look on a map, if you were a Russian leader, you wouldn't like that too much. You know, where do they think they're going to stop? Because while the U.S. said we're just peaceful alliance, it's a military alliance, and Russia viewed it as a threat, I think understandably. Now then Russia responded, Putin responded grabbing Crimea and making hostilities in Ukraine, and then Putin definitely intervened in a lot of elections, including the U.S. election in 2016. So both sides are like this. But this is crazy. Again, first of all, it's a big risk of war. It's a big risk of conflict. And it's a big cost for everybody. Russia doesn't get anything out of this. The United States doesn't get anything out of this. Everyone in between, I would include Bosnia and Herzegovina in between, Everybody suffers from this kind of tension, just like suffering during the whole Cold War period. So this is where, as an economist, I just view it as an incredible waste of time. How about we think about building better economy? How about investing in education? How about changing from coal to solar and wind power to clean up the air and stop the climate change? Let's solve some problems rather than continually making new problems.
Let's now discuss the late 80s and the early 90s in the former Yugoslavia. You were the advisor to the last Yugoslav Prime Minister Ante Markovic. So, a logical question: why couldn't economy overcome nationalism and politics that led to bloody war?
Yeah, I was asked to come in September 1989 here, and I met with the presidency of the late Yugoslavia and also with the Prime Minister, Prime Minister Markovic. It was very late in the day because Yugoslavia was already falling apart and there was a hyperinflation at the end of 1989. I believed that Yugoslavia should continue. That was my own just view, that this would be better for everybody if the economy could be made to function and one could avoid conflict. And I believe that Yugoslavia should have had its external debt owed mainly to Europe canceled so that the economic situation could improve. I gave this advice to the authorities, both the presidency and the prime minister. I think it was well received at the time. Mr. Markovic, who was prime minister, started an economic stabilization and recovery plan at the beginning of 1990. And in the first few months, it started to have some very positive results. But two things happened. One was that the Europeans were not interested. And my recommendation to Europe and the United States was, give this country a chance. Cut the debt, stop making economic demands on it, allow the conditions to improve.
They didn't understand the conditions.
But they did not accept that because they're foolish, they're short-sighted. You know how Germany really dislikes giving anyone help because they're quite stingy with their money, actually, when it comes to relief on foreign debt. They said, that's not our problem, that's your problem, just like vis-a-vis Greece recently, where there's a huge economic crisis, and Germany has not been very helpful during this whole period. So they didn't understand. And also, maybe politically, their idea was, well, maybe it's inevitable, maybe a good thing that Croatia, Slovenia become independent, and so on.
But you see Milosevic as a key negative person, do you?
Well, he played a horrible role also in that period because just after Mr. Markovic started his plans, Milosevic started to take every action possible to break the economic reform. So you ended up with two forces. One, Europe either deliberately not helping or stupidly not helping, and Milosevic definitely trying to break Yugoslavia at that point, for a greater, or for his own control, whatever. So by the first 6 months after it started, Yugoslavia was falling apart, and economics can never be more powerful than politics. This is a basic.
But what could you say? What's the role of the international financial institutions in the process of disintegration of Yugoslavia and today's relations on the Western Balkans?
I think in general, the most you can say, or the least one can say about what the West did in the breakup of Yugoslavia is that they were stupid. Because either they deliberately went along with a crisis, letting it get deepen, or they were not smart enough to know that when you have a serious crisis, you should help. Part of my job in economics for the last 35 years, because I've been doing this for a while, has been to say when you have a deep crisis, and especially when a country or a region is in economic trouble, the rest of the world should help at that moment so that the crisis doesn't become a catastrophe. So this is a very basic idea. It goes back to another economist, John Maynard Keynes, who was the most famous political economist of the 20th century. And after World War I, when France made a very harsh peace with Germany, demanding massive reparations, John Maynard Keynes said that is a very dangerous idea because there will be a backlash. And he predicted that this harsh peace would lead to a harsh political response. Well, we know it was the worst ever in history, with Hitler coming to power, the biggest disaster certainly that we can think of in history. And Keynes's point was very simple, which is don't be stupid. When a region is in trouble, give it help. And that is my most basic economic philosophy. So every time I advise countries in trouble, Bolivia in 1980s, and other Latin American countries, Poland in 1989, Yugoslavia in 1989, Russia in 1991, I said to the big powers, help. Sometimes they did help because they had maybe geopolitical reasons that they wanted to help. For instance, in Poland, when I said cancel Poland's debt, they said, yes, we'll do it. But that was geopolitics. When I said the same thing, cancel Russia's debts or cancel Yugoslavia's debts, they said, no way. Same advice, two different outcomes. Not my fault. The fault was these politicians. Sometimes they do things for convenience or for other reasons. Sometimes not. In general, my experience with politicians is that they're not very accurate in solving problems. They're often making problems worse, and they're not very well versed in history because they repeat the same stupid mistakes over and over again. And sometimes the outcomes are terrible. And whatever one thinks about whether Yugoslavia should or shouldn't have survived as one country or as it became many countries, the process of the breaking up was nothing less than a catastrophe, a tragedy, war, mass violence, a legacy that continues to this day because of people fleeing the country, people leaving the country.
You can see consequences everywhere, even now.
So this remains till today.
But when you say...
Who do I hold responsible for this? The politicians here and the politicians on the outside. It's both. But I always hold the politicians of the powerful countries to an even higher account because they have more levers. They have more chance to create reasonable conditions. And they did not do so in the case of Yugoslavia. They did not do so in the case of Russia. And you get very bad results over time. When
you say that the World Bank needs to return to its mission, what do you mean by that?
Well, the World Bank is a very particular institution. It's at 18th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. People should understand that because the White House is at 16th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue, and the President's Executive Office is at 17th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue, and the World Bank is the next block. So even though the World Bank is a global institution, it's really a U.S.-led institution, and it's been with a U.S. president since the beginning, since 1946. So if the U.S. is smart, the World Bank works well. If the U.S. is led stupidly, then I'm afraid the World Bank tends to not be very good. And the World Bank has had different phases. During the 1980s and 90s, it was horrible. It got a little bit better after the year 2000 for a while because it learned something. But right now, the World Bank is pushing, I think, again, too much on simplistic solutions coming from U.S. slogans rather than on holistic solutions that are needed right now. So that's what I meant when I complained about the World Bank. It's too much influenced by U.S. ideology.
Education, health, infrastructure, what comes first?
Oh, those three come first. Basically, you invest in those three plus good, peaceful relations internally in this country with the three big ethnic groups saying we're all for a shared investment-led future. And then with the region, I would say no enemies anywhere. Good relations with the European Union, good relations with Turkey, good relations with Russia, good relations with other countries. So
what about America?
I would try to have good relations, but Mr. Trump is very nasty, so I would just try as best as possible to have good relations. But the real future of this country, and I would, by the way, in that regard, add good relations with China, because China is now the world's single largest economy. They're also looking for investment. They actually bought, as you know, the Chinese now control the port of Piraeus, Athens port, no less. So they're in the neighborhood. They're ready to invest, and I would say good relations with China in that regard as well. For a small country, the first thing is pray for peace all around, try to maintain good relations on all sides, and try to have investments in people, in physical infrastructure, in new technologies, and in protecting the physical environment. It's not, you can't really choose one or the other. You need a kind of package deal.
How realistic is that what happened to Greece happens to one country in this region?
Greece is the country that has done the worst in the European Union and had the biggest crisis after 2008. Really a Great Depression, actually. And part of the problem was that Greece managed its economy very badly. Too much borrowing, taking on new debt, and so forth, not looking carefully to the future, not saving enough. But then when the crisis hit, it was already clear in 2010 or 2011 with the Greek economy in a terrible crisis, that Greece needed some help, again, from its counterparts, especially Germany. And many of us begged Germany, cut Greece's debt. They're in a big crisis. Help. Don't just leave it go. But I met with the German finance minister many times, and they were not interested, just like they were not so good in 1990 here, just like the United States was not so smart with Russia in 1990, and on, same kind of mistake over and over again. So Europe let Greece suffer a catastrophe with very little help. Now they've given some modest amount of relief in the last couple of weeks, actually, that's supposed to be part of a recovery, and maybe it will help, but the truth is
this week.
Yes, the truth is that Greece's economy is still 25% cut, no growth, but also reduction that's bigger than anything we've seen in modern history of a peaceful economy in a catastrophic decline. Unemployment, massive. Talented young Greek people already all left. So the legacy of this crisis will be many, many years, just like the legacy of war in Bosnia will be many, many years, because young people with skill, with energy say, oh, I'm going to build my future someplace else. And that's a terrible burden for a place.
Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as Serbia, wants to be in the European Union, but what I want to ask you is, how much will EU membership help countries that are trying to join it when it comes to economic problems?
On the whole, get in. It's the right thing to do. It will be better for this country. But one has to say, of course, that the European Union that I'd like to see is not the European Union we have right now. When I was advising Poland, and Poland wanted desperately to get in the European Union, or Slovenia, or Croatia, the European Union itself was more unified and more dynamic. Right now, of course, one country's leaving the European Union, the UK. There are big divisions, especially with Central Europe, Poland, Hungary in particular, fighting the European Union. There are populists all over who are anti-migrant, like the Northern League in Italy. This is not a wonderful period for the European Union. I'm a believer in the European Union because I know as an economist there is no other way except regional integration. There's no other answer, true answer for any economy. So I've spent even the recent weeks meeting finance ministers throughout Europe to talk about how to make the European Union more dynamic again. And I really hope that they will do that. From the point of view of Bosnia and Herzegovina, I would say definitely work towards the membership. But understandably, people will have second thoughts because Europe doesn't look so healthy, but much better to be in than not in. But by the time this country gets into the EU, which I hope is soon, I also hope that there are better relations.
But when you say soon, could you predict the year?
I can't predict the year because that's up to them. I would like it to be soon because I believe in unification, I believe in enlargement, I believe in the need.
But what do you predict about the world in 2000, let's say 2030?
I believe that in 2018 we have a choice. And one choice is that we regain our senses and say, let's not waste our time on conflict. Let's stop the wars that are going on right now. Let's end the hostility between the major powers. And let's solve some problems like global warming or high inequality or illiteracy or other big problems. That's one choice. It's realistic. It's not impossible. Or another choice is that we have more Trumps and we have more Salvinis and we have more populist leaders, everyone saying, my country first, my country first. And then we have complete stupidity, frankly, because if every country tries to be first, we're all going to be last in the end. This is a nonsensical approach. The whole idea of America first is such an obnoxious idea because, of course, it can mean two things. One, it means that the president's going to look out for America's interests. Okay, that's a kind of mild, obnoxious statement. But the other is that America should be dominant. And that's a totally stupid idea, in my opinion, because how should any one country say we're dominant over other countries? And so all of these politicians who say, I'm going to protect us by putting up walls, by putting up borders, by fighting other ethnic groups and so forth, this is the road to disaster. And 2030 could end up being disastrous for us also. Who knows it better than this region? how one can go from...
Let's hope it won't happen.
Of course. But, this is the place that even a small spark set off a great disaster. And you have more historical memory here than probably any place in the world to say, don't do this again. And to say to the politicians, stop the fighting. Because what's really important is the building towards the future. And you can tell I don't love politicians. It's a job category that seems to promote dangerous personalities or put people into irresponsible visions where they play with other people's futures.
Well, let's finish this interview with politicians, but with the voters. I've seen some of your messages before the last elections in America, and you said that we need candidates that can win without campaign contributions. Could you say, is this a universal message? Because we have elections soon in Bosnia.
There's a general problem. There are two huge kinds of problems in politics that are interacting sometimes. One is the hate politics. We are psychologically primed to be vulnerable to demagogues who say, oh, you should hate that other group. Okay, this is clear. I don't need to say too much more about that. It's obvious that we are somehow wired in a way to distrust others. Very dangerous. Politicians have figured that out for a long time. Blame the other and you get votes. The other danger of politics is that democracy is a very good idea of one person, one vote. But when it turns into $1, one vote, like in my country, or €1, one vote, when money becomes the center of power, of course, then you get a different kind of problem, which is you get big inequality, you get powerful people, rich people deciding the future, and you get a lot of corruption. And unfortunately, many democracies have turned into a money game, not only a power game. The United States is a money game in politics right now. Every election at the federal level, $6 or $8 billion now, $billion, is given to by powerful people to candidates for their campaigns. And you can imagine what kind of policies they support in the end. Whoever is giving them the money decides the politics in the end. Then there are other countries like the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark. They've done a wonderful job of keeping money out of their politics. I don't quite know how they do it. They're among the very few places in the world that has democracy without corruption. So we should all study their examples as well. I would say to young politicians, which I do always, don't go to collect money from powerful people. Don't say, I need it because otherwise I won't win. Go tell the public, nobody's paying me, no one's buying me off, I'm not beholden to any special interest, there's no company that stands behind me, there's no oil sector that stands behind me, there's no corrupt billionaire that stands behind me. I'm here to represent you. I believe that's a winning political strategy as well as a proper strategy, because when you then become elected, you are not beholden to whoever paid your bills.
Professor Sachs, thank you very much for this exclusive interview.
My pleasure to be with you.
Poštovani gledalci, bio je jedan od najvažnijih ekonomista današnjice, profesor Jeffrey Sachs. Ostanite uz N1, hvala na pažnji.